The Valois Dynasty, the bloody and mysterious royal family of France. In the long and turbulent history of France, there was a moment when the royal crown stood not as a symbol of unity, but as a prize soaked in uncertainty, ambition, and war. From that chaos emerged a new ruling house, the Valois Dynasty. But their rise was not peaceful. It was not inherited smoothly. It was taken through political crisis, dynastic collapse, and one of the most controversial successions in medieval Europe. At the beginning of the 14th century, France was ruled by the Capetian dynasty. For generations, this house had maintained the French crown, but by the time of King Charles IV, the dynasty was collapsing under its own fragile inheritance system. When Charles IV died in 1328, without a surviving male heir, France faced a crisis that threatened the very structure of monarchy itself. Who should rule France? The English king, Edward III, immediately claimed the French throne. His claim came through his mother, Isabella of France, a daughter of the French royal family. By blood, he had a connection. By ambition, he had a crown in sight. But the French nobility rejected his claim. They invoked an old Frankish custom that later became known as the Salic law, arguing that the French crown could not pass through the female line. This legal interpretation changed the course of European history forever. Instead of Edward III, the French nobles chose a cousin from a different branch of the royal family, Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI. And in that moment, the Valois dynasty was born. But this was not a calm beginning. It was a declaration of division. England refused to accept the decision. Edward III did not abandon his claim. Instead, he turned political disagreement into war. This dispute ignited one of the longest conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. From the very start, the Valois kings ruled under the shadow of conflict. Philip VI faced immediate military pressure. France, despite being larger and wealthier, suffered devastating defeats against the English forces. The Battle of Crécy became a symbol of French humiliation. Later, Poitiers deepened that humiliation further, where King John II of France was captured and taken prisoner to England. A king in captivity meant a kingdom in crisis. France began to fracture internally. Nobles lost trust in the monarchy. Cities faced heavy taxation. Rebellions began to appear. The authority of the Valois crown was questioned not only by enemies abroad, but also by instability at home. The Valois dynasty, in its early decades, was not a story of glory. It was a struggle for survival. Yet, within this collapse, a turning point slowly began to form. King Charles V, later known as Charles the Wise, understood that France could not survive through brute force alone. Instead of relying on large-scale battles, he rebuilt French strength through strategy, administration, and long-term planning. Castles were retaken slowly. English positions were weakened through patience rather than direct confrontation. The monarchy began to regain stability, not through sudden victories, but through calculated recovery. For a brief period, it seemed as if the Valois dynasty had finally stabilized France. But peace in Valois history was never permanent. The reign of Charles VI brought another collapse, this time not caused by war alone, but by the mind of the king itself. Charles VI suffered from severe mental illness, and at times believed he was made of glass, afraid he would shatter if touched. With a weakened king, power shifted into the hands of rival factions within the French court. Two major political groups emerged, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Their rivalry tore France apart from within. Civil conflict replaced national unity. Assassinations, betrayals, and internal warfare became common. This internal division gave England a new opportunity to strike again, intensifying the external war. At this stage, the Valois Dynasty was fighting two wars at once, one against England and one against itself. France was collapsing from within. Then, unexpectedly, history introduced an unlikely figure, Joan of Arc. A young peasant girl claimed to hear divine voices commanding her to save France. In a time of despair, her presence became a symbol of hope. She inspired French troops, broke the siege of Orleans, and restored confidence in a broken kingdom. Her actions did not end the war immediately, but they changed its direction. The momentum slowly shifted back in favor of the Valois crown. King Charles VII eventually regained control over much of France, uniting the fractured kingdom. By the end of the 100 Years' War, England's presence in France had been drastically reduced. The Valois dynasty had survived its greatest trial. But survival did not mean stability, because what followed would be even more dangerous. An age of religious wars, court conspiracies, and internal bloodshed that would push France toward another cycle of chaos. The Valois story was far from over. It was only beginning to reveal its darkest chapters: Catherine de Medici, royal conspiracies, and the French wars of religion. After the fragile survival of the Valois crown through the 100 Years' War, France did not enter an age of peace. Instead, it entered one of the most dangerous and unstable periods in its entire history. The enemy was no longer only England. The real threat now came from within France itself: religion, politics, and the royal family. At the center of this storm stood one of the most controversial and powerful women in European history, Catherine de Medici. Catherine was born into the powerful Italian Medici family of Florence. She was not originally destined to rule France, but through marriage to Henry II of France, she became queen consort of the Valois dynasty. And through her children, she would eventually become the true power behind the French throne. When Henry II died unexpectedly in 1559 after a jousting accident, the Valois crown passed to their young and unstable sons. First Francis II, then Charles IX, and later Henry III. None of them was strong enough to fully control France. This weakness created a vacuum of power, and Catherine stepped into it. She was not officially king, but she became something even more influential: the decision-maker behind the throne. But France at this time was already deeply divided by religion. The Protestant Reformation had spread across Europe, and in France it created a growing group known as the Huguenots, French Protestants who followed Calvinist teachings. Opposing them were the Catholic majority, supported by the monarchy and powerful noble families like the House of Guise. What began as a religious disagreement quickly transformed into a political explosion. France was no longer one kingdom. It was two hostile camps living under the same crown. Catherine de Medici tried to maintain balance between these factions. Her strategy was not purely religious. It was political survival. She believed that if one side gained total dominance, the monarchy itself would collapse. But balancing hatred is not stability. It is delay. In 1562, the tension finally exploded into open war. The French wars of religion began. Blood spilled across cities and villages. Armies formed not just under kings, but under religious identity. Nobles raised private militias. Entire regions became battlegrounds between Catholics and Huguenots. The Valois monarchy, already weakened, now faced a kingdom tearing itself apart. One of the darkest moments came in 1572, during the marriage of Catherine's daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant leader. The wedding was meant to unite France. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most infamous massacres in European history. On the night of St. Bartholomew's Day, violence erupted in Paris. Thousands of Huguenots were killed in the streets. The massacre spread to other cities, turning celebration into slaughter. The exact role of Catherine de Medici in this event remains debated, but history often places her at the center of the political decisions that allowed it to happen. Whether she ordered it directly or not, the consequences defined her legacy forever. France plunged deeper into chaos. The monarchy's authority weakened further as regional warlords and noble factions gained more control. The Valois kings struggled to maintain legitimacy. Religious war became political war. Political war became survival struggle. The kingdom was no longer united under one crown in any meaningful sense. Meanwhile, Catherine continued her efforts to preserve the Valois dynasty. She used diplomacy, marriages, alliances, and manipulation of noble factions to prevent total collapse. She was often described as ruthless, but in her mind, she was preventing France from being destroyed completely. But history does not remember intention as clearly as it remembers outcome. As the wars dragged on, a new figure began to rise. Henry of Navarre, a Protestant noble who was also a distant heir to the French throne. He would later become Henry IV, but at this stage, he was both a rival and a threat to the Valois line. The conflict between Catholic and Protestant forces reached a breaking point. The kingdom was exhausted. Cities were ruined. The royal court was divided. Even the monarchy itself could not agree on its own future. Catherine de Medici died in 1589, leaving behind a fractured France and a collapsing dynasty. In the same year, Henry III, the last Valois king, was assassinated. With his death, the Valois dynasty officially came to an end. But even in its final moments, the dynasty did not fall quietly. It collapsed in violence, conspiracy, betrayal, and religious hatred. And from its ashes rose a new dynasty, the Bourbons, under Henry IV, who would finally bring an end to the wars of religion and attempt to rebuild a shattered France. The Valois dynasty was gone, but its legacy was not peace. It was a warning written in blood that when politics, faith, and ambition collide inside a royal family, even a kingdom can turn against itself. Valois kings, assassinations, chaos, and the collapse of royal France under Henry III. By the time France entered the final phase of the Valois dynasty, the kingdom was no longer simply divided. It was breaking apart at its core. The wars of religion had already torn society into Catholic and Protestant factions. Noble families were armed against each other. Cities were unstable. The monarchy itself was losing the ability to control even its own capital. At the center of this collapsing world stood the last true Valois king, Henry III. Henry III inherited a throne that was already unstable, violent, and politically poisoned. He was not ruling a unified kingdom. He was ruling a battlefield disguised as a nation. From the beginning, Henry III faced distrust from all sides. Catholics considered him too weak and too tolerant toward Protestants. Protestants saw him as unpredictable and politically dangerous. Even powerful Catholic factions, especially the ultra-Catholic House of Guise, began to act like an independent power inside France. The king's authority was being replaced by factions. One of the most dangerous forces in France at this time was the Catholic League, led by Henry of Guise. This group did not simply oppose Protestantism. They began to challenge the king's own authority. In their eyes, loyalty to religion mattered more than loyalty to the crown. Henry III found himself trapped between two collapsing forces: religious war outside the palace and political conspiracy inside it. France was no longer governed by one center of power. It had become a fragmented structure where loyalty shifted constantly, and violence was often the only language understood. In this environment, assassination became a political tool. Cities like Paris turned into centers of tension. Armed militias controlled streets. Preachers influenced crowds. Rumors could trigger riots. The monarchy could no longer guarantee stability, even within its capital. Henry III attempted to control this chaos through shifting alliances. At times, he tried to cooperate with Protestant leaders to counterbalance the Catholic League. At other times, he tried reconciliation with Catholic factions to restore unity. But every decision only deepened mistrust. France had reached a point where compromise was seen as betrayal. The turning point came when Henry III decided to strike directly against the House of Guise. In 1588, he ordered the assassination of Henry of Guise, one of the most powerful Catholic leaders in France. This act shocked the entire kingdom. To many Catholics, it was not political action. It was sacrilege. The king had killed the leader of their movement. Paris erupted in outrage. The authority of Henry III collapsed almost overnight. The capital itself became hostile territory for the king. Henry III was forced to flee Paris. The city, once the symbol of royal power, was now controlled by enemies of the crown. The monarchy had effectively lost its own capital. At this stage, France was in open civil war. The Catholic League declared opposition to the king. Protestant forces, led by Henry of Navarre, continued their struggle for survival. The monarchy stood in the middle, isolated and weakened. Henry III had become a king without a kingdom. Desperation replaced strategy. Authority replaced by survival. In 1589, history reached its final and irreversible moment. Henry III was assassinated by a radical Catholic monk named Jacques Clement. The assassin believed he was acting under divine mission, killing a heretic king. The attack was sudden and brutal. Henry III died shortly after being stabbed, marking the official end of the Valois Dynasty. With his death, a royal line that had ruled France for more than 2 centuries came to a violent conclusion. But the story did not end with peace, because the assassination of Henry III did not create stability. It created a power vacuum. The rightful successor was now Henry of Navarre, a Protestant leader who became Henry IV. However, France refused to accept a Protestant king immediately. The wars of religion continued. Cities resisted. Armies kept fighting. The country remained divided. The Valois dynasty ended, but the conflict it left behind continued to burn. Looking back at the final years of Henry III, one truth becomes clear. The dynasty did not collapse because of a single enemy. It collapsed because of internal fragmentation. Religion divided the people. Noble factions weakened the state, political ambition destroyed unity, and the monarchy, once the strongest symbol of France, became the center of its instability. The Valois Dynasty ended the way it lived its final century, through tension, violence, and political breakdown. But even in collapse, its legacy remained powerful. It shaped the future of France, influenced the rise of the Bourbon dynasty, and left behind one of the most intense lessons in European history, that when a kingdom loses unity within, no crown is strong enough to hold it together. When the Valois dynasty collapsed in 1589, with the assassination of Henry III, France did not step into peace. Instead, it stepped into a deeper crisis, one where the throne itself became a question, not an institution. The crown legally passed to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant noble and distant relative of the Valois line. He became Henry IV, the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. But in reality, becoming king and being accepted as king were two very different things. France at that moment was still fractured by decades of religious war. The Catholic League refused to accept a Protestant ruler. Major cities rejected his authority. Parts of France remained under armed control of Catholic factions who believed that a Protestant king could never be legitimate. Henry IV did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited a broken nation. For years, France continued to bleed through civil war. Armies shifted sides. Cities changed allegiance. The monarchy struggled to enforce control even over its own territory. Henry IV quickly realized a political truth that would define his reign. France could not be ruled by religion alone. It needed unity above faith. In 1593, he made one of the most famous political decisions in French history. He converted to Catholicism. His reported statement, often summarized as "Paris is worth a mass," reflected a brutal political reality. Whether or not the exact phrase is fully historical, the meaning was clear. Control of France required acceptance by its Catholic majority. This conversion changed everything. Gradually, resistance weakened. Cities that had refused him began to open their gates. The Catholic League lost its central justification for rebellion. Many nobles, exhausted by decades of war, began to accept stability over ideology. In 1594, Henry IV was officially crowned King of France in Chartres. But even after his coronation, the country was not fully unified. War continued in pockets across France. Spain supported Catholic resistance. Rebel forces still operated in several regions. Henry IV responded not only with military action, but also with political reform and reconciliation. His goal was not revenge. It was reconstruction. One of his most important decisions came in 1598 with the signing of the Edict of Nantes. This edict granted limited religious freedom to French Protestants, known as Huguenots. It did not create full equality, but it allowed them to live, worship, and participate in French society without fear of persecution in many regions. This was a turning point in European history. For the first time in decades, France had a legal framework that attempted to balance religious conflict instead of destroying one side completely. The Edict of Nantes did not erase tension, but it reduced the scale of violence significantly. With this policy, Henry IV began rebuilding France from the ruins of civil war. He focused on restoring agriculture, repairing infrastructure, and stabilizing the economy. Roads were rebuilt. Trade was encouraged. Tax systems were reorganized. The monarchy regained authority not through fear, but through practical governance. France slowly began to recover. But the legacy of the Valois period still shaped everything Henry IV did. The trauma of religious war, noble rebellion, and dynastic collapse remained embedded in the political structure of France. The Bourbons learned from the chaos that destroyed the Valois. A kingdom divided by identity cannot survive without compromise. Henry IV himself understood that unity was more powerful than purity. Yet his reign also carried the shadow of unfinished conflict. Not all factions accepted peace. Not all enemies laid down arms. France remained politically fragile, even as it became more stable. In 1610, Henry IV was assassinated, repeating the tragic pattern of royal violence that had haunted France for generations. But by that time, the foundations of a stronger France had already been laid. The Bourbon dynasty would go on to dominate French history for over 2 centuries, eventually reaching its peak under kings like Louis XIV, the Sun King. And yet, the roots of that future empire were formed in the ashes of Valois destruction. The Valois dynasty had ended in chaos, assassination, and civil war. But from that collapse emerged a lesson that reshaped France forever. Power without unity leads only to fragmentation, and faith without tolerance leads only to destruction. The transition from Valois to Bourbon was not just a change of dynasty. It was the rebirth of France itself. After Valois Henry IV, the Bourbon rise, and the end of France's religious wars. When Henry III of Valois was assassinated in 1589, the Valois dynasty ended not with ceremony, but with violence. A monk's blade did not just kill a king. It ended a centuries-old royal line that had once ruled France through war, plague, rebellion, and political collapse. But dynasties do not die quietly in history. They leave behind chaos. And in that chaos, a new king emerged. Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France. Yet his crown was more a claim than a reality. France refused him. The reason was simple. Henry IV was Protestant in a kingdom exhausted and radicalized by decades of religious war. To many Catholics, especially the powerful Catholic League, a Protestant king was not a ruler. It was an enemy occupying the throne of France. So the kingdom split again. Some provinces accepted him out of political necessity. Others rejected him entirely. Paris itself, the symbolic heart of France, remained hostile. Spain supported Catholic resistance. Noble factions continued their private wars. The monarchy, once absolute in theory, now existed only in fragments across a broken land. Henry IV did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited a battlefield disguised as a nation. For years, France remained trapped in this final phase of the French wars of religion. It was not one war anymore. It was a collection of overlapping conflicts. Royal legitimacy versus religious identity. Central authority versus noble power. Survival versus ideology. Henry IV understood something that previous kings failed to grasp. France could not be ruled by force alone anymore. Victory would not come from battlefields. It would come from acceptance. In 1593, he made the most controversial decision of his life. He converted to Catholicism. This was not just a religious act. It was a political calculation that changed the fate of France. His famous idea, often summarized as "Paris is worth a mass," captured the harsh reality of kingship. To rule France, he needed France to accept him first. The effect was immediate and powerful. Opposition began to fracture. Many Catholics who had resisted him for years began to reconsider. The Catholic League, once dominant, started losing unity. War fatigue had already weakened resistance. Now legitimacy was shifting. In 1594, Henry IV entered Paris. For the first time in years, the capital recognized a king again. But even then, peace was not instant. Some regions still resisted. Foreign powers, especially Spain, continued to support opposition forces. France was still unstable, still dangerous, still divided. Henry IV responded with a combination of military pressure and political compromise. He understood that destroying enemies would not end conflict, but integrating them might. In 1598, he issued one of the most important documents in French history, the Edict of Nantes. This edict granted limited religious freedom to French Protestants Huguenots. It allowed them to worship in specific regions, hold public office, and live under legal protection in many parts of France. It was not perfect equality. It was not full tolerance. But it was revolutionary for its time. For the first time in decades, France had a legal framework that tried to contain religious conflict instead of eliminating one side completely. The result was gradual stabilization. Cities reopened. Trade resumed. Agriculture recovered. Roads and infrastructure were rebuilt. Taxes were reorganized. The monarchy slowly regained authority, not through fear, but through governance. Henry IV shifted the focus of the French crown from survival to rebuilding. France began to heal. But healing did not mean forgetting. The trauma of the Valois collapse still shaped everything. Distrust between religions, fear of noble rebellion, and the memory of civil war embedded deeply into French politics. Henry IV's reign became a turning point. He was no longer just a successor to the Valois. He was the founder of a new political reality. The Bourbon dynasty was born from Valois destruction, but it learned from Valois failure. Where the Valois were consumed by division, the Bourbons aimed for centralization. Where the Valois collapsed under religious war, the Bourbons attempted controlled tolerance. Where the Valois lost control of nobles, the Bourbons gradually strengthened the monarchy. But even this new order was not safe. In 1610, Henry IV was assassinated by a religious fanatic in Paris, ending his reign abruptly. Once again, France witnessed the violent removal of a king. Yet by this time, the foundations of stability were already in place. The worst phase of religious civil war was over. The monarchy was recovering. The Bourbon system was beginning to solidify. The Valois dynasty had ended in fragmentation, violence, and internal collapse. But its destruction became the foundation of what followed. France did not emerge from this era unchanged. It emerged reshaped. Stronger central authority, reduced noble independence, and a cautious balance between religion and politics became the new political reality. The fall of the Valois was not just the end of a dynasty. It was the painful rebirth of modern France, the legacy of the Valois, from ruin to the rise of absolute France.